So welcome to this public lecture hosted by the 21st Century China Center at the UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. I'm Molly Roberts. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science, and I'm the co-director of the China Data Lab here and 21st Century China Center. And we are so honored to welcome back Lizhi Liu to discuss her new book, From Click to Boom, The Political Economy of E-Commerce in China, which explores China's e-commerce boom, which created a $2 trillion market with 800 million users in just 2 decades. Liz has previously presented her work here in 2020, so we're really happy to have her back. So Lizhi Liu is an assistant professor in business and a faculty affiliate of the Department of Government at Georgetown University. Her research interests include political economy of development, digital economy, and Chinese politics. And her work has been published in many premier outlets, including the American Economic Review Insights, Studies International Comparative Development, and Minnesota Law Review. And she's the recipient of the 2020 Ronald H. Coase Best Dissertation Award in Institutional and Organizational Economics, and the 2019 APSA Best Dissertation Award in Information Technology and Politics.
When Molly won the Best Book Award.
And she holds a PhD in political science from Stanford. So we're so excited to have her. But before we begin, just a few housekeeping items, especially for those people on Zoom. So first, this lecture is being recorded. After the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. So if you are on Zoom, if you are in the audience, just raise your hand. If you are on Zoom, please submit your question using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So what we'll do is we'll curate and consolidate the questions, and then we will facilitate your asking the question to the speaker. So let's turn to you. The floor is all yours, Liz.
Thank you so much, Molly. Thanks to everyone for being here. It's my great honor to present this book again, actually, because I presented the early draft of this book many years ago. It took me a long time to incorporate the feedbacks, and actually, hopefully, the final product is better than the previous draft. Okay, so first, let me talk about how I got inspired by the phenomenon and what drove me to do a research project about e-commerce. So back in 2014, when I was a PhD student in political science, I was trying to search for my dissertation topic. I went to this small village in China, in Shandong province. The village was known as a village of beggars because for hundreds of years, in fact, it is a places with soils that's not suitable for farming. And local peasants struggled and could barely support their livelihoods. But they started to actually sell this make these plated handicrafts, but the local market was very limited. But in 2006, several return migrants started to sell these plated handicrafts online and made a big fortune. And other houses quickly followed. And now the village has over 1,000 online stores and has earned a new title, an e-commerce village. In fact, the village had undergone a lot of changes, including its village walls. If you know anything about Chinese countryside, you will know that the government usually painted some of the government policies on this village walls to promote it. And some of the advertisement about the one-child policy was actually replaced by advertisement from e-commerce companies, such as running around for a living away from home doesn't beat selling on Taobao.com at home. So the rise of e-commerce village is only one of many demonstrations of the amazing rise of China's e-commerce market. So if you look at this red line here, you can tell that in early 2000s, China's e-commerce market was nothing or barely existed. But now China has become the world's largest e-commerce market with sales that accounts for over 60% of the global sales on online retail sales, even though China in GDP accounts for about 70 or 80% of the world's GDP. So in other words, compared to other countries, China actually had a leapfrog development or disproportional development in the e-commerce sector. And leapfrog, surprisingly, a lot of developed economies in that regard. But for me, studying e-commerce is not just to study a big market. For me, it actually answered a lot of big questions about Chinese economy, especially its shift in growth models from a export-driven and investment-driven economy to an economy that relies more on consumption and domestic entrepreneurship. And also, I think e-commerce is very important to study because it tied to the rise of powerful tech sector and especially the privately owned platforms. And also, it has driven a lot of social changes, such as the whole society becomes cashless. Even the beggars on the street will have to have a QR code. Otherwise, people wouldn't have cash or change for them. But for me, a theoretical question beyond all of that is that I think the rise of e-commerce market in China is actually something that's paradoxical because it actually points to a key research question that political economists always wonder for many years, which is how can developing countries foster growth in absence of strong formal institutions? Because we know that rule of law is very important because, for example, it prevents counterfeits going into this market. It solves a lot of issues about contract enforcement and others. But e-commerce is actually a market that requires even stronger institutions than offline face-to-face transactions. Because in the offline market, you can always inspect the product before you buy, whereas in the online market, you essentially trade with an anonymous seller who you don't know where it's from. And that actually requires very high level of trust. And legal institutions is actually very important because when you have stronger legal institutions, you can actually create trust in the market and prevent counterfeits going into this market. And more importantly, this is also a large-scale impersonal exchange market that we see rarely in the developing countries. Because we know that in developing countries where rule of law is weak, people tend to trade with someone you know. For example, your friends, or like you always go to the same store, because that's how repeated interactions can create trust. However, e-commerce is large-scale trade between strangers, which is quite interesting. How can you see that in a developing country like China? Because China had the e-commerce boom, in fact, around 2010, when the legal institutions were still very weak, or like not as strong to support the e-commerce market. So my research question is that I see this as a very interesting phenomenon because China not only had an e-commerce boom that required very strong institutions, but without the state, where did this institution come from? And how did China actually leapfrog countries with better rule of law and higher disposable income, such as the Western economies? So that's a possible. So my answer to this is that for developing countries, when the central government sometimes have technical barriers or political barriers to build strong institutions, for example, rule of law, they can outsource part of the institutional functions to digital platforms, especially the private actors in the market. So essentially, you see that the reason why China is having an e-commerce boom is because there's a private and public collaboration in institutional building, in writing the rules for the market. And by the state, by outsourcing a lot of institutional functions to digital platforms, actually build institutions that's necessary to increase state capacity, which I'm going to give you a lot of examples about that. We're also going to talk about some of the effects of e-commerce and also how to make sense of all the regulatory shifts around 2020 when the Chinese government started the tech crackdown, but recently loosened the control in the sector. So in the book, I actually combined both the qualitative analysis and quantitative analysis. The reason why I'm having so many different kinds of research methods is that at the time the phenomenon was very new, and also there was very little prior work about that. And also in terms of research data, a lot of this data were in the hands of big platforms. So it is very difficult to get. But I was fortunate to do all of this work through a very long time of field work by doing interviews, doing some online ethnography, and also use the web scrape data did also online survey, but most importantly also a large experiment that randomized e-commerce access across 100 villages in China, which actually helped us understand how e-commerce access can create some effects in the rural area as well. Okay, going back to the questions about the the institutional foundations of the e-commerce market. I think the conventional wisdom is that, in fact, institutions matter for growth. Because institutions can protect property rights, can provide contract enforcement, and without these institutions, traders will feel reluctant to trade, and investors feel reluctant to invest, and that will delay the development. And a lot of developing countries actually have the problem that they usually have political or technical barriers to build a very strong institutions. For example, in countries like China, there might be, for example, party has a rule by law system, but not rule of law, because political constraints, especially the supreme leader, may not want to be fully constrained by the legal institutions. So I think that is an issue. Therefore, a lot of developing countries is having the problem that the central government is either unwilling or unable to provide very strong institutions in the formal setting, and that becomes a development problem. But in China, a very interesting question is how China could have a very long time of development or very strong high growth despite the similarly weak institutions. And the prior understandings about that is that there is a kind of an idea about competitive federalism model that's going on, even though China is not a federal state on paper, but the central government has delegated or outsourced a lot of economic functions to the local governments and incentivized the local governments to compete with each other, so that the local governments will have the incentive to provide a lot of market-friendly policies, such as tax breaks or subsidies to the private sector, and that actually leads to very high growth of the Chinese economy. Whereas over time, this kind of development model increasingly is having issues. For example, the competition among the local governments not only give them economic power, but also give them capacity and also incentives to erect internal trade barriers that prevents the rise of a national common market and inconsistent local rules. And also the central government, when they delegate a lot of powers to the local government, they also find it even harder to monitor what the local governments are doing. So over time, in fact, you see that growth slows down, and also because the previous growth models, such as state-led investment and export, have started to lose steam, and China needs to search for a new growth model, which is through domestic consumption. But in order to have domestic consumption, you actually need to have a very strong domestic market that could actually accommodate a lot of private sellers and buyers and strangers to exchange in the market in order to stimulate the economy. And very importantly, you also need very strong institutions to support all these market activities in order to encourage everyone to trade in the market. And this actually becomes a very important question for e-commerce, which is e-commerce is a national common market, because wherever you go, you actually are subject to the same kind of a platform rule, and it is a large-scale impersonal market, and it helps domestic consumption. But where did strong institutions in this market come from, given there is a weak rule of law in that period? So that's my idea about institutional outsourcing, which is when the national government is unable or unwilling to provide strong formal institutions, they can outsource part of the institutional functions to key private actors, such as the digital platforms. Digital platforms is suitable in this role because not all the private actors can actually do that. But digital platforms, they're neither the seller or the buyer. So the very different phenomenon of China is that most of China's digital platforms are not similar to Amazon. Because Amazon here is a big retailer, they're a big seller themselves, whereas China's dominant platforms are actually, most of them are marketplace model, similar like eBay. They do not sell their own products, they just host sellers and buyers. That actually increased some of the incentive for them to be encompassing, to be balancing the contrast, different interests in the market. And also, I think importantly, this is digital enforcement, encouraging transactions between strangers, and also they're digital. So it's very easy to scale up this kind of institutional rules in the market. And digital platforms then actually have the capacity to substitute for or complement formal institutions. And I'm going to give you some example about how platforms provide private institutions in the weak rule of law environment, and why did the authoritarian government actually allow this to happen, even though private institutional building in this context has been actually quite disrupting. So first of all, what kind of a Chinese platforms are and why this is different from the United States. Of course, there are a lot of similarities, but one big difference, especially in China's e-commerce boom, which is around 2010, is that China's e-commerce market is actually much more platform-based. To give you an example, if you want to buy a pair of Nike shoes, a lot of people in the United States will buy from Nike.com instead of Amazon. Whereas in China, you buy from very large online trading platforms such as Alibaba's Taobao, which I'm going to give you an example for. And China, actually over 90% of the e-commerce transaction take place on platforms instead of independent websites by brands. But in China, the platforms is not only providing the functions of connecting sellers and buyers, but in fact, it becomes a private suppliers of market institutions such as contract enforcement, dispute resolution, in the absence of very strong state institutions in it. And the example I'm going to give is China's largest e-commerce platform, Taobao.com. If you look at Taobao, you think, well, this is not very different from Amazon. However, Taobao is actually much larger and provides a greater variety of products, including some weird ones, such as crab. This is a live crab, dragon boat, a real dragon boat. Bad Debt, this is more than 4 million RMB. Okay, Boeing, which was successfully auctioned. Courses assets, a side product of the anti-corruption campaign. And also, this is an interesting product, like whether you love Trump or do not like Trump, you may have some interesting buying, which is a Trump Buddha or know everything Buddha that supposedly, if you have it, you can make your company great again. So Taobao is owned by Alibaba. As I said, it's an eBay model. It doesn't sell its own products. It hosts a marketplace for more than 800 million buyers and a lot of sellers to interact with each other. It is a very large market, and it is funded by Jack Ma, and Jack Ma sing karaoke in a company anniversary. But as I said, Taobao, in fact, you should not expect this kind of a big market to exist, because in China, the trust level due to weak legal enforcement was actually lower than in the Western market, and there's a lower adoption of credit cards. So in fact, you shouldn't see this kind of a large, long distance in-person exchange market to exist. But in the chapter, I actually show how Taobao, because of the market competition, because they have to survive, they have to overinvest in private institutional building more so than Western platforms. I have a detailed account about, for example, how they address the problem of contract enforcement, fraud prevention, dispute resolution, and even build this online jury system when they can randomly draw jurors from experienced Taobao users and ask the people to vote on disputing cases, and whichever side that gets simple majority vote will actually win the case. So these are the ordinary users, but they actually crowdsource justice. In fact, a lot of Chinese platforms are using that. So learn from Taobao's experience. And from an institutional perspective, you may wonder, are these institutions enforceable? They are, because there is an escrow system in Alipay, which I'm happy to elaborate in the Q&A. And also the institutions are adaptable to the changing needs of the users, because the users can actually vote on Taobao's House of Representatives for rules. And this is, of course, an old advertisement that was 10 years ago, but because they actually used an image of the US Capitol Hill to lure people to vote, and says that to make a rule, you have a voice, right? Basically, this is a place where you can rule down non-essential rule changes, but in the Western market here, interestingly, even though here people can vote, but you probably cannot vote on the changes in Amazon, right? Of course, the online institutions have a lot of limitations. I'm happy to talk more about this, like how people game the rules, how people engage in fake reviews, and also there are limitations on the digital enforcement powers by the platforms. However, I see this still as an improvement of the counterfactual. In other words, without the institutions, you would never see this kind of a large transactions happening between sellers and buyers, and especially strangers. So the second part is, why did the authoritarian government even allow this to happen? Because the conventional wisdom is that the private sectors in China, especially in the past, was marginalized, and the Chinese government was very worried about their political power, and they did not really participate in institutional building. So I see this, there are two types of outsourcing. The first type is what I call de facto outsourcing. So this is the government, even though they can regulate these platforms, they actually acquiesced to the private institutional development, which I'm going to talk about later. And the second part is the de jure outsourcing. So this is based on written agreements between the government and the platforms, and a lot of explicit endorsement to what the platform has been doing. So in terms of de facto outsourcing, this is what I found very interesting and somewhat counterintuitive to people's understanding about China, which is when we're talking about China, we oftentimes think about the reason why Chinese economy is going is because the Chinese government gave a lot of money and land to the private sector, industrial policy, all of what the government has been doing. Whereas I think there's another measure that the Chinese government has been doing, but it's difficult to measure because it doesn't involve a observable action, which is what I call strategic non-regulation, which means that the government, instead of giving land or giving credits to the platforms, they give freedom to the firms and let them to experiments. And this kind of autonomy is very important in authoritarian regime where the state intervention was the norm. Actually, this is in a lot of new areas, new industry, the government usually chose this. They did not regulate the new industry, not because the government lacked the information or regulatory power. To give you an example, I used to think industrial policy mattered a lot in the development of the e-commerce boom. And I interviewed a lot of merchants, and I said, what kind of government support you want from the government? And they said that no regulation is the best support. So this basically informed me that this kind of autonomy is very important. Another example about this strategic non-regulation is Alipay, which is a very important institution to help Chinese e-commerce to grow. But when Alipay was invented, in fact, it was in a legally gray area, and there was a very huge legal consequence that Jack Ma had to persuade his employees who was worried about the legal risk, saying that if someone needs to go to jail for Alipay, okay, let it be me. So because they realized there might be a very big legal risk. So in order to make it live, they actually had to do that. So the state did not ban it. Actually, they legalized it after 8 years. So this is basically another example that they could have banned it, but they didn't. So this actually, I think, is very important and has some tie to the Chinese philosophy, which is that it is also important to not just look at what the government has done, but also the fact that sometimes the government can practice not doing, because the government's not doing is also very important for the market vitality and the growth of the economy. Okay, wu wei is important. Another part about this is de jure outsourcing. De jure outsourcing is something that we understood very well, which is there's a lot of a partnership between the central, local government, especially central government, to use e-commerce to use platforms to fulfill a lot of governance functions. So there are legal enforcement, for example, combat commercial bribery, scam, enforce debt repayment by the Supreme Court using platforms enforcement power. And there are also areas of governance that goes beyond the marketplace, that goes into the social governance areas, because once the platforms is having the capacity to connect people, to enforce, to monitor market activities, they can actually be leveraged and used by the state to fulfill a lot of functions, such as recovering missing children in China. Actual platform can also play a role in it, which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A if we have time. So the political logic about outsourcing, of course, this is a way to overcome technical barriers. And also for the government, when reforming government's institutions is too hard, outsourcing is also a good way to let other people to do it. But most importantly, I think it also parallel with China's early reforms when the central government outsourced institutional functions to local government. But in this case, it's outsourcing functions to private platforms. And the beauty of outsourcing or delegation is that whenever there is a big problems with the institutional rules or failures in governance, that's a problem of the platforms, a private actor, and it has nothing to do with the government. And the government can actually play a mediating role. For example, when there is a protest against Taobao 15 years ago, in fact, the government then become a mediator in this effect. And because the tensions that could have been directed towards the government now gets buffered and directed elsewhere. Effects of e-commerce, I will just comment on two things very quickly. So we did some experiments on how e-commerce changes rural development, because in urban areas, there are a lot of development results. They drive consumption, they drive entrepreneurship, but we want to understand in the least likely place in rural areas where people are have much lower income, how can e-commerce solve some of the development issues? So what we did is that we conducted the first experimental experiments in Chinese rural areas with the treatment of e-commerce. So we try to understand how e-commerce affects the household welfare, how they affects the peasants' selling and buying behavior. So what we did is that we did the experiment as part of Taobao's rural expansion plan. At the time, they wanted to introduce e-commerce into 100,000 villages. And what they do is that they build this kind of a e-commerce service point in a central village store. So the store looked outside, it looked like a normal store. But if you go inside, there weren't too many products in display. There's just a big monitor, a computer, and also a terminal manager who can help the peasants to buy and sell through the terminal, because most of the peasants actually do not know how to use e-commerce, and they don't have online payment method. And the platform also subsidizes all the shipping costs that's going through the village and also going out of this. So essentially, to understand how e-commerce changes rural household welfare, we randomize the location of this kind of a e-commerce e-commerce terminals across 100 villages in 8 counties of 3 provinces. So this is where we did it, Anhui, Henan, and Guizhou. And these are some of the sample villages that we did the experiment. This is a very hilly villages in Guizhou province, one of the poorest provinces in China, but they were getting e-commerce, which is amazing. We also had a very detailed data collection on over 3,000 households. And also we collected the price changes with the local physical stores to capture all the changes and the pressures on the local physical stores and see all these indirect welfare gains. We also get 28 million transaction records from the platforms, try to test the external validity of this study. So each of the interviews actually takes more than 1 hour. So we ask very detailed questions about peasants' selling and also buying behavior. And this is the outcome, 42 boxes of Fuchs questionnaire. So if you were to do this again, of course, this is like many years ago. If you were to do this again, do it with iPad, don't do it with a questionnaire. So what we found is that there's a minority of the households after 1 year that ended up using the e-commerce terminal, because for those of you who understand Chinese villages, in fact, it's hollowing out villages. A lot of young people were actually not living in the village. So that probably explains this low adoption of e-commerce. But for people who actually are using the e-commerce, they got sizable economic gains. However, what we found interesting is that most people gain because they now have more purchasing power. With the same amount of money, they can now buy more products. So in other words, there's a consumption effects on e-commerce. E-commerce equalized consumer rights for rural peasants, for rural areas. However, we don't find production effect. We don't find they have any effect on production, selling behavior, entrepreneurship, partly because in rural areas, perhaps there are other reasons, for example, lack of talent to actually make them to use e-commerce. at the time. So we found that, in fact, only by providing market access through e-commerce is insufficient to narrow the urban and rural divide. We also find heterogeneity in gains from e-commerce. We found there's a larger gains for more remote villages. In other words, there's an interesting reduction in cross-village inequality. But within a village, there might be increasing inequality because there's a larger gains for younger and richer households and for those who live closer to terminals. Effect two is that I found e-commerce actually reorganizes state business relations in China. I will be very quick because I want to have a longer time for Q&A. But the starting point is that in China, you have to know government officials, right? This is almost a stylized fact. A lot of people actually know, and especially because China has decentralized economic system, so that the state business relations, interactions, political ties are usually localized. However, e-commerce provides the opportunity that you're no longer constrained by the local market. You can now sell to the national market. And does this actually increase the autonomy of the merchant group? Does this mean that they no longer depend on the state? So what I found is that merchants indeed have less interactions and less reliance on the local governments, but they're still not autonomous. I will tell you why. I have online surveys on both the online merchants and offline merchants, meaning the merchants who own brick and mortar stores and use matching because this is cross-sectional data. I cannot do too many like fancy stuff. But what I found is that e-commerce participation for merchants among private merchants make them more autonomous from the local government because they have less interaction with the local government, less incentivized to forge political ties with the local officials. And in my interview, some of the local officials complained about their lack of information and lack of regulatory power about this sector. So it's quite interesting that what this is going on. However, I think this actually increased the power of the Chinese central government because they can now control this small village, individuals and business through the help of the national platforms. This is because even though right now merchants gain autonomy from local governments, but they now have shifted dependency on the platforms. This is actually a picture before the big sales day in China. Of course, Jack Ma is no longer having this. I think it's no longer politically safe for people to do that. But about 10 years ago, before the big sales day, the merchants would actually worship Jack Ma as a Chinese god, right? They have a lot of tributes, cigarettes or fruits and everything, try to worship him as a kind of an interesting event to pray for a prosperous Chinese Cyber Monday. So this basically shows how now e-commerce merchants actually rely on the platforms instead for a lot of critical business resources, such as store rank. However, of course, China remains an authoritarian country. National platforms, even though they have bargaining power towards local governments, they still are subject to the strong regulations of the national government. So this actually creates an opportunity for the central government to reverse its information asymmetry with the local governments and provides them with additional means to regulate the economy. And the central government, in theory, can turn platforms into points of centralized control. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about regulatory shifts, because you may wonder, okay, why do we see all these changes in the regulatory space, right? Given that it seems that the government and the platforms work together perfectly. So in China, in fact, in the past few years, we see very different, kind of a regulatory landscape. Basically, before 2020, you see 20 years of hands-off, laissez-faire government policy towards platforms. This is when the strategic non-regulation actually took place. But between late 2020 and mid 2023, we see technology crackdowns after the abrupt suspension of Ant Group IPO, and there has been a lot of sort of regulations on the private sector. So they went back to supporting platforms to lead growth and also compete globally. But why this is, when we see outsourcing, we still see regulations. In fact, regulation is intricately connected to outsourcing. First, because the government was confident about its regulatory powers. That's why they outsourced, because the Chinese government can cut off the internet in China. So that is sort of a nuclear option that they have. That's why they have confidence in their regulatory power. That's the reason they can outsource so many functions to the platforms in the first place. And second, regulations actually serves as a ex post measures to fix the problems that's generated by outsourcing, for example, principal and agent problems. And also, I actually was inspired by Susan Shirk's work, which I really love about US-China relations. And I found the dynamics here about what's going on during the tech crackdown is the platform actually overstepped and the state overreacted, which generates a disastrous outcome. This is because when platforms, the strength of platforms is also its province. For example, it is very easy to scale their the regulations. They're very powerful. But on the other hand, when they become bigger, they also generates a lot of the big problems, such as data privacy issues and others. And the state actually overreacted the challenges from all the problems from the tech firms and basically imposed a proliferation in various terms, proliferations of regulations on the private sector and also the platforms, which actually killed, eroded the market confidence in this market and made it the whole, there's a lot of like market values of these platforms actually dropped a lot. But the question is, this actually happened for this platform's problem was long existed. And some of the regulations are arguably overdue. So, but why did it all happen in late 2020? I think one possible explanation, of course, I don't know for sure, but one possible explanation is the overconfidence on both the government side and also the tech firm side. On the tech firm side, in fact, in 2020, that was a time that everybody felt very optimistic about China's tech sector. If Ant Financial were able to get listed, it will be the largest IPO ever in history. So everybody, a lot of people in Ant Financial actually bought houses in Hangzhou before the IPO, who later got very regretted. But at the time, the reason why Jack Ma had all these criticisms against the regulator, probably also because he has said this for a very long time, but didn't have any consequences. So he probably was overconfident about the tolerance of the government based on his past judgments and experience. But the government might also be overconfident in their regulatory powers because this is late 2020 when China used very decisive and quick policies to end the first wave of the COVID-19 viruses. When the US was suffering, Europe was suffering, but China actually did quite well and using this very quick actions against, basically had a zero COVID policy. I think the government was also confident in its regulatory approach and thinking that they may take the same approach against the tech platforms and quickly solve the problems that the areas already have. So when both sides are overconfident, there is an issue that they might be having some collisions. At least, otherwise I feel like it's very hard to explain why we see something like that. But what's going on after tech crackdown is that there is actually even more institutional outsourcing because now the platform had even more incentive to showcase to the government that they're very useful, they help the state development. It's just that they lost the incentive to innovate in something that the government has not directly asked them to. So according to my, for example, interviews afterward, I found that there's more collaborations and there's a shift towards more like a de jure outsourcing, contract-based collaboration. And the government, the platforms try to get immunity or assurance from the government that if there is an unintentional break of the rules, they can be forgiven. So in conclusion, I think the Chinese market, e-commerce market in China actually reveals a digital path to development, which I call institutional outsourcing. This is not just in e-commerce, but I think in a lot of the areas, for example, in censorship, the government doesn't do censorship by itself, but outsources to platforms to do that. So in executing political functions. And China's development also, I found that it's not just about industrial policy. There is a very big part of this is also about the government's strategic non-regulation. In other words, the other side of the yin yang, which I showed. I think broadly, the big takeaway from my study is that institution don't matter, but a lot of focus that we have had is about government institutions. But nowadays, in fact, you interact with a lot of digital companies. The firm-driven digital institutions also matter a lot. And there's actually a tricky balance between the private and public regulatory powers. It only produces the best outcome when the public and private regulatory powers can be more balanced, and neither side is too strong. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, it's such a great book, and I read earlier versions of it, so reading the final version was just awesome. So I really enjoyed doing that this week. So I just had a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So one is, you focus a lot on the case of e-commerce in China, but I feel like the theory has a lot of broader implications. And so I was already, while I was reading the book, trying to categorize different platforms that we see around the world into the degree of institutional outsourcing, right? And I'm wondering, what other context, so we see things like, banks in the US are doing some fraud detection stuff. They're cooperating with law enforcement. We see things like social media platforms cooperating, removing, terrorist activity, like legal content, this kind of stuff. Maybe not the juries, the democracy happening on Taobao, right? So, but what do you think about a spectrum? I mean, where else in the world are you seeing this type of institutional outsourcing? In what other sectors? Is it just e-commerce? Is it other places? If we think about this going forward as platforms sort of are a more pervasive part of our lives, how do you see a broader, how do you see the degrees of this?
Yeah, thank you so much, Molly. And this is a wonderful question. In fact, in the concluding chapter of my book, I conducted the other case studies, even though not in full depth, about the potential extensions of this model. Because what I see is that even though in the strong rule of law countries, such as in the United States, there are still areas, right? If you think about this as a spectrum of, weaker government regulations versus strong government regulations, you see a spectrum. In the United States, there are also areas that do not have a lot of government institutions in place, or the government have very different ideas. And I do see that, for example, China, the government's regulations on hate speech is very different from the case on child pornography. So that's the two cases I'm basically comparing, because in the United States, you have section 230, which basically gives a lot of the regulatory powers and autonomies to the platforms to decide. But on the other hand, because the child pornography is actually a federal crime, so there's a very strong legal basis for the platforms to do it. Whereas in the United States, there's a very strong tradition of freedom of speech. So hate speech is something that is more difficult to understand, and also this kind of outsourcing, whether it's legally valid, is something that's also debatable. So I see this institutional outsourcing as having two conditions. One is that we need to see some sort of a private institutional building, and second, we need to see that the government would have a implicit or explicit consent or collaboration with the platforms or the private actors. Another area I see definitely is the global trade regimes and others, because there's no word of government, right? A lot of these kind of global exchange was actually on the platforms or economic sharing and Temu, and those platforms can shoulder a lot of regulatory capacities and helping the government to extend their power and also carry out this kind of governance functions. I definitely see that. And some of the examples right now I already see in developing countries is, for example, Grab is this like Southeast Asian ride sharing companies. They started to help the government deliver, for example, the equipment during COVID-19. And also there has been a lot of this kind of a platform provided services in developing countries already.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I guess my other question is sort of related to what you just said. It's sort of about the internationalness of these platforms, right? Like we see the tariffs go into place on goods from China, and then the post office is, wait a second, we can't accept any of these small packages coming from e-commerce. Okay, we're going to accept all of those because they can't handle that institutional. They can't do that, right? They don't have that institutional capacity to check all this, so they would need to collaborate with Temu in order to do that. You know, do you see a world in which, like, you know, people are voting across borders on the on the institutional rules of these e-commerce platforms, and does that, like, how does that change our conception of states and other things like that? Yeah, like, I mean, can you push this into international relations?
Oh, yeah, that's a very, very interesting idea, especially about this user participation in the institutional rulemaking, right? When WTO right now is facing some issues, right? Whether we can have a cross-border platforms, regardless of whether e-commerce or other areas can do this. I haven't seen it yet, but I think in the future this might be maybe a way to go, because I think a lot of countries right now, especially I think Western countries, feel that pretty much, especially governments, felt threatened by, for example, this Chinese platforms exporting a lot of small packages to either US and European countries. But I think, like, even without this e-commerce, those packages probably will still get delivered to either to the Western world, but just through wholesalers, right? Or other more dispersed distribution of packages going into those countries. So I think actually with the centralized e-commerce platforms, it's easier for the government to regulate them by using e-commerce or these platforms as a proxy of state power and try to enforce some of the regulations. I definitely see that happen. Whether there will be democracy on the platform, I don't know yet.
Yeah, great. Okay, so just to make sure I have time to open it up for questions. So are there any questions from the audience? Like,
I have a question about the political logic part. Because your theory seems to portray government on one side and the platform. The two were, you know, sometimes the government either outsource or to practice non-regulation. The story that I sometimes hear, and this happens, you know, in the case of Jack Ma, was that there's one part of the government that were basically for this new cutting edge, you know, digital commerce idea. And they got the upper hand in the beginning. They talked to Jack Ma, they got everything. And Jack Ma actually had a really good run with that part of the government. Then they lost power when she came to power, you know, came to positions of influence. And so that's when you say overstep, it's not that they overstep, they overstep from day one, except that they got that part of the government to be okay. And then because of this balance of power within the government, they decided that, okay, this is not going to happen. So the logic, in other words, probably has to do with the patron-client relationship between the government and the digital, you know, companies, platforms. Why is that part not part of the political logic?
I definitely see that. Okay, I think a very honest opinion about this is that I think that's a hard part for political analysis. I oftentimes think that the reason why we always study institutions or structure, because they're relatively more stable, right? We don't really study the personality or thoughts about leaders because they can change in many ways. So I do think that there might be in the political logic based on individual leaders' decision about whether to regulate and to what extent. But it's just like harder to place all the theories on one person's decision, because I do think that there has been in the state's utility functions, they're actually two competing logic at the same time, actually from day one as well, which is there's a development logic, there's also a control logic, right? But before 2020, in fact, all the problems are there, but the development logic was the dominant one. I do think that even for Xi, at the time, he was, even though he's not unlike Premier Li, who was more like a open kind of a supporter for the digital sector, but I think President Xi was also kind of at least was okay with this kind of development. And also given Li Qiang was the party secretary of Zhejiang and had basically his signature policy was also to promote digital economy there. So I do think that there, at least at the time, the whole government at least have somewhat of this consensus that development is a more important logic until 2020.
I have a question about the business logic of of this scenario, because I have some engineering background and I know that it's a very, very costly task for Alibaba to build such a complex institution, right? For example, the online judgment requires a very, very effective concurrent service, right? And for example, it's very expensive, and they could be hiring some people to solve this. It could be much cheaper, and at the same time, it seems like Alibaba and Taobao.com do not have very extremely strong competitor inside this domestic market. So I'm pretty much curious about what's the incentive for Alibaba to extraordinarily build such a very complex and effective institution, given that it's very, very costly and hard.
So I think, in fact, in the digital area, competition is always there. And sometimes if you look at China's e-commerce sector, at the beginning it was eBay versus Taobao, right? And later, when people thought that the duopoly, basically JD and Alibaba's platforms would be there and new platforms will be ever growing in this sector, then you see Pinduoduo. So I do think that the competition is always there. And also in the internet economy, I think a very important part is that you're not just competing with similar platforms, you're also competing with platforms that seem to do other things. For example, Tencent, it runs WeChat, but suddenly WeChat has this red package or like a wallet function, then they can play some sort of they become a direct challenger to Alibaba on these online wallets functions. So I do think that there, Alibaba is having a lot of competitive reasons to build stronger institutions. And also, when I was writing this paper, one thing was on my mind is that I think institutions actually is an outcome. Good institutions is the outcome of competition. But unfortunately, I think in some countries, usually people don't have the rights to vote. In other words, there's no real electoral competition. And it's hard for you to move to other places. So even though there is a competition among local governments, but people found it very costly to move. So that produce limited incentive for the local governments to improve their governance. However, platforms actually is a place where you can vote with your click. You don't vote with your cast, but you can vote with your click. And this kind of a competing governance system sometimes can generate good outcomes because users can actually change. So I do think that maybe digital institutions in that regard have some merits.
So we're going to go to Harry okay.
Just wondering, how is the institutional outsourcing, as you refer to it, in China different from the institutional outsourcing that we have in the US? In other words, both governments seem to allow these platforms to get bigger and address the needs in society and sell what needs to be sold and either sell it themselves or have merchants on the platform. And I guess I'm just wondering what's so different about what's happening in China and here. It seems to be the same type of thing.
Yeah, there are two major differences, even though I think recently we may see like two countries converge to some extent. But I think that the one thing I definitely noticed is that, because the first part about institutional outsourcing is that platforms needs to have the incentive to be very strong economic institutions, such as contract enforcement and others. But in the United States, because there's a stronger legal institutions, much fewer counterfeits, so people have higher trust on online transactions, and they also use credit cards. Therefore, eBay, when they started in the United States, they did well, and they imported actually the similar kind of institutions to China, but it didn't work because people don't trust. Then this is basically a comparison, seeing that in China, the reason Alibaba's Taobao at the time had much fewer resources than eBay can win the context is because they developed Alipay, which is similar to PayPal, but with a compulsory escrow system that actual level of economic institution to help people to trust. So I do find that in the United States, this is not because platforms do not have the technical capacity to build this institution, it's because there's less of a need. So in other words, I see the private institutional building part has been weaker in the United States in that regard. And the second part is that to what extent the state and platforms work together. In China, in fact, Alibaba participated, for example, in the development of the cyber courts. Cyber courts. So basically, it's the world's first, I think, internet courts when the disputing parties, they can zoom in and 30 minutes as a session, and then judges will just like see this, like and rule this. And Alibaba actually contributed to the state legal development in that regard. I know in the United States, there's also some sort of private firms inputting this, but I don't think it's in this extent. And also because if you look at China's platforms collaboration, with the government, you see almost all the provincial level of the government in my book, and almost 2/3, I think at least 2/3 of the central ministries actually signed strategic agreements with platforms on different things. I don't think in the United States, at least for now, you see this kind of a collaboration. But in the future, I don't know, because right now I do see that there is more of a collaboration also in the United States between the government and probably big governments.
Like White House and Twitch.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Well, is there a positive correlation between the local development of the e-commerce and the promotion of the local leaders? And I mean, I ask this question because I see like, e-commerce is so good for local government that it creates a lot of benefits, but actually the cost of or the risk of developing that goes into the central government. Whether it's finance, whether it's overcapacity, whether it's insufficient people for farming, But basically, does that create a moral hazard problem? Like, because the locals political incentive and central political incentive does not align, and do you think this could be a problem, or whether China's doing a good job in mitigating this risk?
In fact, the local governments did not like, they have a very conflicted feeling towards e-commerce. On the one hand, of course, if a place, especially this like a small village or county, suddenly that having a very strong e-commerce sector, then the local leaders get famous, or like there's a higher chance of getting promoted. But on the other hand, what I found very interesting is that local government find it hard to claim credit, because a lot of this local development was not because of the local government support, but spontaneous emergence or entrepreneurship in those areas. Local government actually found it hard to claim credits because they don't know how to help other than advertising the products and endorse it, saying that, well, it is, you can't buy online stuff, you can trust online transactions. Some of the local governments do try to, for example, provide grants and subsidies to these like merchants, but merchants, they're afraid of being expropriated, or like they don't want to pay taxes, so they don't actually apply for these grants. And some of the local governments try to build competing platforms, only host the local products, but they found that once you have Taobao, this is like a nationally commercial private platform, so why would I shop on the local platforms? So I think the bigger problem is that even though e-commerce development might be a good thing for the local economy, but the local government find it hard to justify this is because of our help, this is because of our achievements, rather than the spontaneous emergence of the sector.
Thank you.
Thank you.
our last question.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you very much for the talk and heard a lot. I'm just curious to get your opinion on the question about what do you think are the preconditions for this to work? Because I think you emphasized a lot about government doing practice nothing or do no harm. But I wonder probably the government could make the argument that I build a lot of infrastructure and a lot of supporting systems. So the business see an opportunity there. That's why they spend a lot of effort to develop this further. So I was wondering, what do you see? As for instance, if I'm a policymaker in a developing country, I want to export this to my own country, what should I do?
Yes, definitely. I think infrastructure is a very, very important part. And I do acknowledge that this is one of the preconditions for development of e-commerce or any types of this kind of institutional outsourcing. So one thing I think about India, for example, there's a lot of obstacles in the infrastructure sector offline. Therefore, they found it hard for delivery to happen between different states. And that's definitely become an obstacle for the development of the e-commerce sector. I found that infrastructure is very important because China's sometimes investment in the rural areas, especially, really help the e-commerce in two regards. One is that there is a Cun Cun Tong project, connect the village. Maybe that's the translation for that. Basically, that in very early on, actually by mid 2000s, I think over 90%, 95% of the villages have been connected by roads. And e-commerce doesn't require a supreme condition of roads because in some places when big cars, trucks find it hard to enter, they actually use cattle, they use a motorcycle to deliver the packages. So you don't need a supreme condition, you just need road connectivity. And second is that phone connection in these villages was also solved at the very beginning. Because in China at the beginning, there was just you can dial up internet rather than broadband. And I was told during my interviews, actually broadband is not a necessity for online transactions because online transactions only need customer services, which requires a low speed of the internet. And I asked them, how did broadband actually help your business? He said that when I was doing customer service, I can also watch a video or a movie at the same time. So I do think that this kind of government investment in this area, even though at the beginning, right, it was very early on, but it actually provides definitely some conditions. But it doesn't require this like a huge investment in this area. So I do think that in the future, a lot of developing countries probably will have that.
Great, thank you so much. We're out of time.